Hey everyone, today I want to take a look at Morrowind's Deadzones. So to jump straight into it, Morrowind uses about a 40% square dead zone for its camera. So this is pretty massive. You can see just how far you have to move the stick before seeing any camera movement occur. And square dead zones restrict diagonal movement around the axes, and that scales with the dead zone size. So 40%, this is a ton. See, I can make these large bobbing motions, move perfectly left. This is until I break into these green regions where you start seeing diagonal movement occur. It's much more obvious when looking straight up or down. You have to break out of these dead zones before you start seeing diagonal movement occur. Otherwise, the aiming is, the acceleration itself is fine. There's no turn acceleration, there's no aim smoothing, and you do have options for vertical and horizontal sensitivity. So the acceleration feels fine. You can actually see an issue that I'll bring up in just a bit. But moving on to the movement, you can see it's the exact same dead zone, just tracing the same square. And the same restricted diagonal regions are present here as well. It's much harder to see when moving forward because of how subtle it starts. But when you're strafing, actually strafing has a unique animation. So when you transition over, you can actually see the animation switch. And you can see that the transition is pretty dramatic. You go from perfectly strafing left to moving at a pretty obvious angle, even though you can be pointing pretty subtly. The shaded regions are the run threshold. The threshold in the diagonals goes off this graph in a circular range, which is exactly what you want to happen. That's showing that it's been normalized properly. However, you can see that this is me pushing the stick up until it hits the plastic boundary and pulling off of it a bit. You can see that there's not a whole lot of play. So if your threshold runs outside of this defined ring, you kind of run the risk of players not being able to hit these thresholds. Most players should have, extra bit of play in the diagonals, so that shouldn't be an issue, but that you always run the risk if your thresholds go outside of this circular ring. Now you can see something happening here, and large square dead zones are kind of a very common issue, but something that's very unique to this game that I've found is that the dead zones change after you're playing for a bit, and they can change based on just a certain time played in the game, jumping, going through doors, crouching, waiting. Really anything can prompt this to happen, and you can see it happening here where I can now turn much sooner than I could before. So I had to move 40% before, and now I can move with just this much input. And you can see that the vertical has changed with the horizontal as well. Sometimes these can change separately, so you can have smaller, I've mostly seen when that happens, smaller vertical or smaller horizontal dead zones with larger vertical ones, creating kind of a rectangular shape. You can see this has also happened with movement as well. And of course this does change the restricted diagonal regions. So you can see that you have much more diagonal movement than you did before. Now it's very difficult to test any of these Deadzone Changes because it changes erratically. Sometimes it changes to like 37%, sometimes it changes to 25%. The lowest I've seen it hit is 18%, but who knows, it could get lower than that. And there doesn't seem to be any pattern to it. Sometimes it could be 30%, but then play a bit longer and then it's 20%. It's just very interesting. So despite me showing 40% dead zones here, that's only really happens when you first load up the game, or if you replug in your controller. It's going to change at some point during gameplay. So that's an interesting quirk. I don't think many players are going to complain about dead zones getting smaller on them, especially when they default to this large. If it becomes a rectangle, that can be a little less consistent than a square, but it doesn't really, jeopardize gameplay all that much. The one thing I'd like to say is that because of the acceleration being as snappy as it is, this is probably the most responsive feeling Elder Scrolls game. Of course, this runs you won't be seeing it here, but this runs 60 frames and backwards compatibility on console or on the Xbox. But even if it was 30 frames, the acceleration alone makes it feel much better than Oblivion or Skyrim does. But that about covers it. So thanks for watching, and have a good rest of your day.